Hello, welcome to St Michael's Hill. Today's video I'm going to be working more on the fiddle yard, especially looking at hard standing. So at the moment there's obviously one area of hard standing that was put together by using a scale model scenery kit. I'm going to be looking at a couple of other methods that can be used instead, and basically I'm just going to be working out which I like the most and go from there. So the first method is kind of similar. I'll be using the kind of spare parts of the scale model scenery kit, but instead of using their paper patterns, I'm going to be trying to just paint that up. So whilst it is offset from from their kit, this could be and represents any kind of wood or even plasticard that you can use. So I'm going to be using some of that, and then in addition I'm going to be using some of this. So it's some easy plaster from Knauf, and this is something that Steve Smith from Railway Laser Lines has suggested. So I'm going to be using that probably at this end to kind of try some hard standing around a bit of a curve. So I've laid a little bit of track, given it a slightly exaggerated curve, but that's going to hopefully be used for that. And I'm also then going to just move that loco out of the way, just go up to the current kind of hard standing. So I just want to see how it looks really. So those are the two things I'm going to be doing. The other thing I will be doing is just improving some of the kind of hard standing from scale model scenery. So these textures are actually really good, but I think I can add a little bit more detail, especially kind of to the area in between the tracks. So that's what I'm going to be doing in this video, and hopefully by the end of it I'll be able to kind of decide on a method or two methods to use on the new layout. So the first thing that needs to be done is basically to prepare the area. I have, as you can see, laid this piece of Code 75 from Pico. I've basically just used a bit of Copydex in the usual manner, so that's nearly dry, but I need to give it a little bit more time. It's just tidy up a little bit around these sleepers where there's been a slight excess. But yeah, it's just a good way to lay track really. Copydex is amazingly strong. If you leave it for 10 minutes or so, or sort of maybe a little bit longer, 20 perhaps, you can lay it and it will stick. So this piece here, I put Copydex down, waited about 20 minutes and put it in and curved the track to a fairly big kind of angle really. It's probably getting on for kind of first radius, and it stuck straight away. So yeah, it's very, very good stuff. So the next thing that needs to be done is for me to lay the laser cut wood. I will simply just use wood glue to kind of glue that down. I'm not going to have it quite this long. I want really 3 kind of strips thick, so I'll come out to about here. And obviously there's some area here that's already got some ballast, so what I'll probably do is reduce each of these lengths by 1/3, and then just have the last one kind of set up that way. So it'll look like this, but twice as thick. And then once that's done, I will get out the plaster and basically fill in the gap here, across there. I'll just fill in the gap so we've got a kind of a smooth surface throughout, and then I'll start by painting things. It's not going to look like it would on a layout. There's probably will end up being fairly clear differences between the two strips, but it's about experimentation and trying to find a way that will allow me to kind of move forward on the new layout. So I'll get that done, and yeah, I'll be back to you once the wood's cut. So I've just measured it out, and each one of these strips is 420mm, which if we're going to split into thirds leaves 140mm is 1/3. So I'm going to mark out each one and then just give it a quick cut with a razor saw or something, a fine saw. And then from there I'll be able to kind of start wood gluing them into position. I'll use the smaller thirds as the kind of underlay, and use the full kind of big thirds for the full top surface, just to keep things a bit kind of more even, and we'll go from there. So I've got those extension sections stuck down now. There is a little bit of kind of glue coming out. If you were going to have this as a visible edge, just give it a quick wipe down, but for me I'm actually going to be kind of using the plaster to go right up to it, so I'm not too worried about that. The most important thing is that things are pretty lined up and straight, which they seem to be, so I'm going to go from there. I'm just going to leave this to dry now, probably weight it down with a few things, so just kind of make sure that it doesn't move, and then I'll next be looking at working on the plaster. So it's now the following day and the hard standing is fully dry. I'm thinking, even if I get a kind of fairly crisp paint surface on this, the lines between the two or three boards are quite pronounced, which I think is going to have a real effect on the hard standing. So I may or may not just put a very light coat of kind of filler, or at least fill the gaps, just to kind of make it a little bit more uniform before I put the paint on it. I might do kind of maybe half and half, just to try out two different methods, see how it looks. The next job is going to be to lay the Easy Plaster, and to do that I'm going to just glue down very gently some pieces of laser cut wood, and basically create a border that I don't want it to go around, and then basically put the filler down and go from there. So I've put these in place, and basically they're just offcuts of this stuff that are just laid up too thick. So we'll just kind of start placing them on, and basically it's just a case of I'll glue these down very gently to create a kind of a frame effectively for this to go in. So this goes here, and then put various boards to go up the sides like this. So these can basically be placed anywhere. I've just roughly put out a pattern, but once these are glued in place, I'm going to mask off the inside rails for now, and basically just put the plaster up against this rail here, and then I'll show you what I'm going to do for the inside of the rails. There's a couple of methods I want to try, and I'll go from there. So I'll get these glued down with a very little bit of PVA glue. They need to be be able to be pulled up once the plaster is dried, so I don't want to glue them down too strongly, so it's just a couple of dots of PVA to keep them in place. Obviously where I've gone over the rails, there's a slight kind of gap there, so so that the sleeper can be taken, so that's kind of where that comes from, and just everything lines up as so. So yeah, should be a fairly decent job. I'll get that done now, and once that's glued down, I'll be back with the plaster. So when I'm gluing these down, I'm literally just using two very small spots, and then just placing it into position. And once that's down, it should hold long enough for me to kind of get the filler all in there, but it shouldn't be too difficult to get back up once it's done either. So I'm just going to do all this, and at the moment I'm going to be working on this area here. I will probably do a little bit just down the sides just to fill this gap, to make it a little bit less obvious and look more like concrete all the way around. And I'll probably at this end do a bit of filling in these gaps. This one here especially is a little bit big, so I'll do that, and then maybe leave this end a bit of an experiment without the filling and see how it works. So the wood's all dry now, and as you can see I've masked off the areas that I don't want the filler to get to. I've just obviously covered up the ends of the current hard standing, and also the boards we've laid down, as I don't really want that on there now. Also I've just covered the track pretty loosely, just to keep the filler from getting on the track, which would be a bit of a nightmare, to be honest. So yeah, that should be okay. The next job will be to start laying the filler in these gaps. So I've been told this filler is fairly thick, so I'm going to go fairly slowly with it. But it's just going to be a case of putting it in to the area, and then using this metal ruler to just kind of level everything off and give it kind of a level consistency, and then we'll go from there. So I'll join you in a second. So the Easy Plaster is fairly easy to work with. One thing has to be noted, that it doesn't stick so well to the surface and wants to kind of stick to itself, so I really had to kind of force it around the edges and then fill in the middle afterwards. Once that was kind of fairly close to kind of all being level, I used the steel rule to kind of give it a kind of nice leveled out finish. I didn't want to go for a completely flat surface at this stage, because I want to do a little bit of experimentation. So as the final result shows, there is a fair bit of kind of potting and things like that. And when I talk about experimentation, I just mean I can experiment with having kind of a completely smooth surface, as maybe a new concrete hard standing would be, or something a little bit more old and well worn, shall we say. So I think doing this kind of gives me the option to kind of do both. I can obviously add further material in just to kind of fill out any gaps, or use the sandpaper to kind of sand things down. I will quickly just add a little bit along the edges here just to kind of fill that out, and like I said, I will fill in half of the top boards here just to kind of give a smooth surface without any cracks in to apply paint to. I will leave this end with the gaps in just to see how that affects the kind of painting and final look, if that's the route that I'll be going for on the final layout. So we should have a kind of 4 different kind of hard standing results in the end, or 5 even. So we'll have the scale model scenery section without any additions. I'll make some additions to it along this end. We'll have the Nuff plaster here, which will be done that way, and then some plain kind of scrap wood, and then at the end some plain wood but with filled edges and things like that. So give me kind of 5 options, and I can look at them and decide which one I would rather use for the new layout. And there we go, so that section has also been kind of filled in. Obviously that'll just need a lot of sanding and clearing down once the plaster is dry, but hopefully those gaps will kind of become far less visible. So I'll leave that overnight, and I'll get back to you in just a second. As the hard sanding started to dry, I've just taken a scalpel and run it along the edge of the mould. That's just to make removing the mould a lot easier, and will stop damage to the hard standing area. I've left the areas where it's going to be right up against current hand standing completely clear, so it's should kind of fix up quite nicely next to those. Regarding the rails, I'm just going to clean the top of them. You can see a few areas where the rails have come undone on this track. This one seems to be mostly fine, but I'm still going to just remove that masking tape and just make sure that the top of the rails are cleaned. So it's now the following day, and the plaster is fully gone off and dried. So I'm just going to approach the middle sections before I look at sanding it all down and doing all that sort of thing. Now, there's kind of no right or wrong answer when it comes to hard sanding. Sometimes the middle is left completely exposed with ballast. Sometimes it's fully filled in. It depends what the hard sanding is for and why it's been put together. I've certainly got photos of both ways around, but for this I'm going to try some methods of filling it in. The first one has been suggested by Steve Smith again, guru of all things depot based, and that's to use a piece of flexible rail and basically place it in here and then fill up to that rail, so it allows the wheel flanges kind of clear movement. So I'll try that on this section, and then for the straight section I'm going to use a piece of the laser cut wood and place that in there with a very light coat of the plaster on top. Much like it's been done here, it will dry very quickly and hopefully give me a decent edge. So I'm going to try both of those techniques, and I'll see how I get on. I think with the piece of wood, the best thing to do is just to basically put some Copydex down and just stick that directly to the sleepers, and from there I will just use the plaster, as I said, just to give a nice skim coat. So I'll do that first. Again, when using Copydex, just apply it to the edge or the side that you want done, wait kind of 10-15 minutes until it goes tacky, and then stick it down, and it won't move much after that. And then in the meantime, we're going to get some Code 75 rail, remove the sleepers, and then start to mark out a little track for that to go in, and I'll see how that goes. And whilst I'm waiting for that to go tacky, I'm going to just sand this area down. I will move the loco out of the way, just don't want any dust and things going in there. I have been told that the Easy Plaster is fairly dust free, so hopefully we can kind of just get this sanded down. I'm going to use some fine grade sandpaper to start with, and then a bit of wet and dry super fine at the end, just to give it a really nice polished finish. In terms of the this end, I'm going to leave it like it is pretty much. I will give it a light sanding, but I'm not too bothered about filling holes like this at this stage. I really want it to kind of be a bit more of a decayed area. I know with this stuff, you can always add more and sand it off to be perfectly smooth. That's not really an issue, so I just want to see how it looks without it. So I want to leave that a bit more used. I will still sand it, and then this I'm going to go for a finer look. So that's the experimentation we're going to be doing, and then it'll be time to start painting. So I've sanded that down now, and it's very, very smooth to the touch. So I think the next job is probably to prime the wooden surface. I'm not going to prime this area just because I think it's got a decent grey colour to start with. So one thing to note, when I was removing the masking tape, the paper textures have just lifted a little bit. That's not a massive problem. It just needs obviously a little bit of glue back under there, but just go careful. If you've only stuck it down with Pritt Stick like I've done, it's obviously not going to be the strongest in the world. So I'll put some more glue under there and get that back down. I'm going to obviously mask off the scale model scenery kind of hard sanding here, and also just this end, and generally as I'm using spray primer, probably everything that you can see will be all masked off, so the only thing that'll be left is going to be the hard sanding that needs to be painted. So I'm going to do that now, and I'll get back to you when we're all masked up. So as you can see, the area is all masked up now. Quick tip when masking kind of large areas, you can just use paper. So get some good quality paper, the kind that you get bank statements and bills on. Generally tends to be good stuff, and then just do it like that. Use some good quality masking tape kind of around the edges, get you a really crisp line, and then on top just kind of put regular masking tape and paper, and you'll find that keeps everything nice. I've left a slight gap here just because I want to get the edges, but other than that, it's all been pretty masked off precisely. So I'm going to use some Halford's Grey Primer, just a simple job. What I will be doing is using a mask as well, just to avoid any fumes. I'll just give it a few coats of light kind of passes, and from there we'll have a base that we can paint on later. The first coat's down, I'm just going to wait for that to dry and then probably add a second coat. You can really see the difference between the filled area and the one that isn't. If you look really closely, there are still a couple of lines, but generally massive difference. So it's had a second coat now, looking pretty good, to be honest. Like, it gives me a good basis to start painting on. I think I can already tell that this way of doing things is not going to be quite as good, and probably won't be used going forward, but certainly with a bit of a plaster fill, it's looking pretty nice. So I'm going to peel off all this masking now and get ready to do the painting. So I've now filled the middle of the tracks. Unfortunately, I didn't actually have any Code 75 rail I could cut up and use, which is slightly frustrating because it's an idea that I really wanted to try out, but I don't really want to buy a new piece of track just to cut it up. I thought I had some spare rail, but I didn't, so I've tried out kind of the Richard from Everard Junction technique, which is basically fill the whole thing with the plaster. In his case he used polyfiller, I think, and then just take an old wagon which is going to have a slightly larger kind of flange, and just basically run it through and make a bit of a gap, and then as you can see, it's kind of as kind of borrowed that out. And even now it runs fairly smoothly, but what I will end up doing is cutting a bit bigger gap, either with a scalpel or a Dremel type tool once that's done, and then everything will be sanded down and should run perfectly. I have taken the chance to fill one or two of the holes a little bit, so like I said, I'm very happy to try out some you know, kind of the potted techniques and all that sort of stuff, but I did want it, some of them were a little bit larger, there were a few very big holes, so I've kind of just filled those in a little bit, and yeah, I'm quite happy. With this one here, I Obviously I use the scale model scenery inside there. I've just laid the plaster on first and then and glued it down with some wood glue, which is just drying. So once that's all dry and sanded, I'll start the painting of all the sections. I'm not going to prime this, I'm just going to see how the paint effects work on top of it. Obviously the wooden piece is a lot darker, but I'm kind of just seeing that as another experimentation really. Obviously I could spray this to a darker colour, but we'll start off and see how we go. So I'm going to be painting both these areas using the same kind of technique. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mask off the scale model scenery paper stuff, and then I'll get to work on this section. I'll probably do these sections first and then followed by this one at the end, just because the centre tracks are still a little bit wet. I think this one's pretty much done. This one, thicker one, is a little bit wet still. So I'll make a start on this end and we'll see where we're at. For the base coat, I'm going to use this light grey acrylic paint. I picked this up from the range, so pretty cheap. I'm just going to basically put a light coat, or a coat of this down, and then from there I will use some techniques to add some additional colours. Fairly quickly after starting to get this down, I realised it's a little bit lighter than I wanted it to be really, so I get the first layer down and then I actually just mix in a little bit of a darker shade and start adding that, which is a lot better. It kind of gives me a better colour for sure. Once that's done, I'm going to start using the sponge here to basically start to sponge in a texture. And then once that's all dried, I use the sponge technique again, but to add lighter and darker highlights and lowlights to the concrete to build up the colour. It's a technique that I think works really well, and yeah, as you'll see in a second, the results are fairly pleasing. Now that the concrete is dry, the first coat at least, I'm going to use a hard pencil, so I've gone for a 4H, but we'll see how that goes, and a steel rule to put the expansion joints into the concrete. These can be any size. I'm going to kind of try and follow roughly the ones on the scale model scenery in terms of width of each stone, but I might go for a slightly bigger depth. So I'm going to try that now, and we'll see what the results are like. So I've added those lines now, and added a few kind of hand-drawn little cracks as well, things like that. It's starting to kind of look a little bit like concrete. I think ideally I'd probably have gone for bigger stones, but I just wanted to tie them in with the wooden plank here, so you can't actually now tell quite so much the planks were separate, and obviously tied it in here. But I think for my taste, it'd probably be slightly bigger, but yeah. It's starting to look a lot like concrete. I'm going to add a little bit of kind of weathering powders now, so just get some black weathering powder and just start to kind of draw or use that to kind of add a little bit of texture and a bit more of the darker colours to it, and then probably also start to decorate this area as well using the same techniques. Then I will be adding a little bit of kind of greenery in between some of these cracks to make it look like weeds and things like that growing through, and I think from there I'll be close to being finished. Obviously these two look very different. Right now I think the scale model scenery one is slightly kind of more detailed, but maybe not quite as concrete looking, so you know, it's up to you which one you think is the best. In terms of what's down here, again the lines have kind of gone in. It feels like the pencil's gone slightly into the plaster, so maybe it needed a little bit longer to dry, but yeah, it's not too bad. I'll add a bit more of the colour. I've not gone over yet with the sponge to put in the differences, so hopefully this end will look fairly nice. And actually these two ends have kind of gone together fairly well. There's not a huge kind of difference, and once the paint's been done up a little bit, it'll be even more kind of seamless, so actually quite pleased with how well these go together. So here's how it looks after the weathering powders have gone down. Been a little bit heavy in some areas, but if you know, that's not what I want on a real layout. I can just not go quite as heavy. I think it definitely looks best in kind of smaller batches and corners and things like that. But yeah, it's gone on quite well. Again, with this end, it's gone on a little heavier just because of where the kind of crannies are, although it has to be said I still need to go over this with the sponge, so that's going to lighten up quite a lot. On the scale model scenery stuff, I've changed the idea. I've put it up this end, but it's gone on okay, I guess, but I think it doesn't look quite right in between the tracks there. I've gone for something very heavy where a lot of oil will be spilt, but it just doesn't really have that look of kind of oil, so I'll probably add to that with some kind of glossy paint and things like that and try and build up that way. The last stage for now is going to be to add a little bit of greenery, like if weeds and things like that are coming up through the cracks. What I'm going to use is this, so it's not actually rocket car glue. I have actually just put some scenic cement inside the bottle. The reason for that is because it's got such a fine applicator, so I'm just going to use that to provide a little bit of glue, and then I'll go from there and just add a little bit of foliage, and I'll get back to you once that's done. So there we go, I've got some of the greenery down. I'm just going to wait for that to dry. I've used the very smallest bits of foliage. Some of this bigger stuff will kind of come off when it's dry. I think the best effects are kind of around here, where it's kind of really the kind of dust almost at the bottom of I think of foliage. So yeah, really happy with how that's gone together, and once it's all dry, I'll show you how it looks. So it's now the following day and everything's pretty much done. I've added a few other bits, so I've put some scale model scenery railings up. I've painted a kind of distressed and old yellow line. That was simply just a case of masking off a line and then dry brushing it. So along the way it kind of goes in and out of completeness, just to give it kind of an old and worn look. A lot of the kind of greenery's kind of been pulled back a little bit, but hopefully it gives an idea of some well-used concrete. I've then just put some ballast around the edge just to kind of finish off the scene a little bit. And so I think overall I'm fairly pleased with some of the techniques. I think the scale model scenery stuff is great, however it is a little bit inflexible. So I think for me it's probably not something I'll end up using on the layout in this form. So with the kind of paper overlays, I think I much prefer the way it looks here. So this is the boards from Scale Model Scenery, and instead of using the paper printouts, I've just painted it myself. So I much prefer this sort of look. The lighter concrete kind of works for me, and just seems a bit more flexible. Also, the Naphthalster is also great, especially for kind of the older, more kind of decrepit looking concrete. So I think again that's something that might find a place on the new layout, depending on kind of the plan. But yeah, I'm really pleased with kind of how it's all come together, really. Let me know below in the comments which you think looks the best, and which you would use for your layout. I'd be really interested to know what people thought. I certainly have some ideas from this about what I'm going to take to my new layout, which I will be revealing details of fairly soon now. Just kind of working on a few bits and getting videos ready, so we'll be coming to you with that fairly soon. But this exercise and the whole fiddle yard really has kind of helped me decide on kind of the way that I want the track to look, and some hard standing and all that sort of stuff. But it really shows kind of a little scene, and actually this area is almost getting to a point where it's a little layout in itself, which is just, you know, it's quite interesting. And certainly the skills that I've picked up since I worked on the main part of the layout have really improved, I think. So yeah, very happy with how this looks. Very aware this video has already gone on quite a long time, so I'm not going to leave you with any running shots today, but I will see you very soon on St Michael's Hill, and I promise to get a lot more of a running session in the next week's video. So see you very soon, and thank you for joining me. Bye. Thanks very much for watching the video today. If you want to see more, check out the video in the top left-hand corner of the page. This week's shout-out goes to Colchester International. It's a great layout that I really enjoy watching the videos. Recently there's been an update, so go check that out on the link on the bottom right-hand corner. Bye.